Joining us now, Senior Senator from Virginia, Mark Warner. Hey, Senator, great to have you with us.
Thanks, John. I didn't hear you list me at the open chain oyster roast.
You want to come?
I'll check my schedule. I don't know whether Mark would want me to show up there or not. But
I'll ask him. I bet he would.
I've worked a lot with Mark. He's a good guy.
I'm gonna ask him today, and I'm sure he would love to have you there. Mike Lee's going to be there. I'm going to be there. The Fräulein's going to be there. So all that good stuff. By the way, my wife, the Fräulein, says hello. Wanted to
well, tell her hello back. That's great.
She wanted to tell me that tell you that you're the only Democrat she's ever voted for in her whole life.
Everybody needs a token, and I'm proud to be your token.
She's your token Democrat. Okay. Senator, Iranian warships sailing into Yemeni waters with apparently arms for the Houthis in defiance of UN sanctions. Now the U.S. Sending ships out there ostensibly to stop them, maybe intercept them. Can you tell us what the deal is?
Well, we've deployed, I believe, the Teddy Roosevelt and another ship from Norfolk to those waters as well. This will be if these Iranian ships deploy weapons to the Houthis. We've had evidence. The Saudis obviously have felt, as well as the Yemeni president, that Iran was supplying arms. This would remove any of their lies where they say they're not. This is an extraordinarily explosive area. The Houthis. The interesting thing here is that the Houthis. It's not just the Houthis. It's the former president, Saleh, I believe was his name, who has still got loyalty from a lot of the military factions because, the Houthis are a small minority, about 35% of the population. Mm-hmm. Long story short, this is one more example of where the whole region is a potential tinderbox. And, one of the things that Egypt and other countries said was that they would look at ground forces. I believe if Iranians move their ships in and actually deliver weapons, it would be interesting to see whether the Gulf states, including Egypt, would put ground forces into Yemen.
So would there be, Senator Warner, a potential confrontation on the high seas?
John, I don't believe there would be, but everything, these are very narrow waters. This is potential for disaster, particularly when we're at the stage on the P5+1 of whether the blanks are going to get filled in. There are some good things in those documents. There's an awful lot of questions. I'm really glad that Congress is going to have a chance to review whatever final document. One of the things, John, that I've focused on the most, now back onto the nuclear negotiations, is how do we make sure that if we don't have a deal, I still think there's a high probability that we won't have a deal, that we maintain the international coalition. The hardest thing would be is if we reject and the rest of the world says, hey, you guys blew this up on purpose, and we're going to go ahead and start trading with Iran, because our ability to clamp down on Iran has been when the whole international community were with us.
Okay, so if I understand you correctly, Senator Warner, you're saying that you think there's a likelihood that there would not be a deal with Iran that was sanctioned by Congress, right?
No, I'm not saying likely. I'm saying that there's a lot of details left. I mean, I need to understand how the administration is saying sanctions could be removed, but the sanctions that went to terrorism and other subjects stay in place. How does that work? How do they intersect? There was one of the questions I had is about whether they're going to remove the enriched uranium. There's some question coming back now that they're saying that they will actually dilute it, which would mean permanently it could never be converted. Actually, that would be better than simply sending it to Russia, but we need to see what's happening there. I've been very, I get the fact that they got to try to sell their document differently than abroad when the Iranian leader says certain things. But when you then hear Zarif, the negotiator, also saying certain things, there's a heck of a lot of questions. This is why I think Congress needs to review this document.
So, Senator Warner, right now, from what you've seen of the framework, do you lean one way or the other?
Well, I think the good size was that you took the thousands of kilograms down to 300 kilograms in terms of uranium. I think you do have a lot of the centrifuges. They're going to continue to be able to develop, bringing the active number down to 300. Step in the right direction. Is it 13 years or 15 years breakout before they have breakout time? I still put me in the undecided category, John. There's a lot to be filled in. I do think that if we're up in that 15-year area with real verification, now that's the question is the verification going to be random, able to go everywhere, including military sites? That might be worth, because in 15 years, I said on the Intel Committee, in 15 years, we may have a whole host of other ways to destroy nations based on weapons that are being developed by not only us but other countries as well. So, this is still, you have to put me in the solidly undecided camp. I want diplomacy to work, because the thing that I worry the most about is I don't think we're going to be able to put the sanctions back on, because I think you're going to see Russia, China, and even the Europeans say, hey, we tried that route. There was a reasonable deal. We're not with you on sanctions, so that just moves us straight to the military option.
We're chatting with U.S. Senator from Virginia, Mark Warner, Senior Senator. Senator, I've got a question texted in from me from House of Delegates member in Virginia, Republican, and former Navy SEAL in Virginia Beach, Scott Taylor. Delegate Taylor says, since the U.S. has a policy of balancing Iran-Saudi for decades, do you believe it's smart to be negotiating with Iran and allow them the capability to enrich or continue to enrich uranium at a time when they have the most powerful army in the Gulf?
I think this is a negotiation. Remember, I remind folks, this P5+1 started under President Bush. This has now been 9 years of negotiations. It's been the international community. Yeah, I think it is appropriate to negotiate. What we've also seen, particularly since the upsurge in violence in Yemen, is every one of the Gulf states are buying very sophisticated aircraft and armaments from the United States. Clearly, the Saudis have been our longer-term allies, although they have been episodic at best in terms of putting their money where their mouth is, whether it's in Syria or elsewhere. But I think, remember, this was the whole international community trying to say to Iran, we want to stop your nuclear program. I think it is appropriate that we're negotiating. Now, let me paraphrase Ronald Reagan, where he said, trust but verify. With the Iranians, I wouldn't even give trust. I mean, I think you got to assume they're not playing straight. Right. That means you got to double down on verification.
All right, makes sense. By the way, Delegate Scott Taylor wanted me to thank you for answering his question.
Well,
now,
Scott, hey.
West, former Navy SEAL. Now, why wouldn't we just continue on with the economic sanctions, which obviously had an effect, Senator Warner, because they brought the Iranians to the table in the first place, and you look at the extent that they're basically exporting chaos around the Middle East. Why would you put them in a position to have more money?
John, fair question. We were but one piece of this whole international sanctions regime. Remember, we've had sanctions on Iran since the hostage crisis. They really only started to bite when we built the whole international coalition, and we really fully extended them to banking. Our toughest ability to pass sanctions is to lock Iran and then banks who do business with Iran out of the financial system. I think there's been growing pressure from countries in Europe and obviously the Russians, who are big supporters of the Iranians. And again, this goes back to President Bush to say, hey, we got to at least try to negotiate with them. And the challenge right now, and this is the part, and when I was in India earlier in the year, and I met with Prime Minister Modi, who's a good friend of America, but he was basically saying, hey, you guys put sanctions back on. We're not sure we're going to go along this next round. They say they've been doing business with Persia for 2,000 years.
Right.
So I really, the issue that hasn't gotten enough attention, I believe, just personally, is how we maintain the sanctions regime. Now, if Iran cheats or if Iran, doesn't fill in the details or walks away, which I think is a good chance, our ability to keep the sanctions in place, I think, goes up. This is what made me so damn upset with that letter sent by 47 senators, which is like, it was like they were trying to help the Iranians. They were making the case that if this thing blows up, it was the Americans that blew it up, and that gives the Europeans off the hook. We got to keep international sanctions regime, because if we don't have sanctions, we only got military, and that we got to keep that option as well. And I am very prepared to use that to prevent Iran from getting a bomb. But let's try negotiations, but let's also keep those sanctions possible, and they will not be kept in place if it appears that we were the ones that walked away.
We're with U.S. Senator Mark Warner, by the way, on that letter by the Republicans to Iran. You were 100% right on that. That made absolutely no sense. It was just political grandstanding, in my judgment. What about the fact that Vladimir Putin's regime is now selling S-300 missile defense system to Iran? How do you stand on that?
Yeah, I think it's bad. I think it does not fit within the technical definition of what was part of the sanctions regime, because they're defensive weapons. But it is a definite play by Putin that says, okay, guys, you don't get this deal done, we're gonna go back and doing business with them. It is, I think, a reflection, quite honestly, back to where I know you and I have agreed, John, when I've had a lot of critiques of the president, but when we drew the red line on Syria and didn't act a couple of years ago, I think that was a long-term strategic mistake for our country. Right. And what's also exacerbates it is the Europeans, who still rely so much on Russian gas. They just haven't been. They have been weak-kneed at best in terms of maintaining the sanctions regime against Russia.
Absolutely. I think a lot of what's happening now, you can date back to the Syrian red line. I don't think you ever should have had the red line to start with. That was the start of this whole thing, no doubt. I want to move to the domestic front. The Trade-Pacific Partnership Agreement, this is not, in my judgment, free trade. It's managed trade. I think it does damage to the U.S. manufacturing base and screws, once again, the American worker. How do you stand on this?
Well, John, I'm a little surprised at your position there. I actually believe that America can compete in the rest of the world. I think when you're looking at 95% of all the future partners are abroad. I support the TPA. I think this is for a couple of reasons. One, there is a lot more transparency in this. Congress is going to get a chance to review it. American public is going to get a chance to review it. I think that we're talking about a different circumstance than when NAFTA was in place, where we had this, we were the rush to low-skilled jobs leaving our country was going to take place. It may have sped it up, but this TPA, which would lead to TPP, gives us a framework where, in a part of the world where there's no set of rules at all. I mean, China can currency manipulate. I think there ought to be some efforts to deal with currency manipulation in a standalone bill. But some on the left who say, that there's not strong enough environmental and labor standards. Well, Vietnam's got no labor standards or environmental standards at all. At least putting a floor. And what I'm really worried about, John, is that, and I don't know if your listeners saw this, but about 3 weeks ago, and this was because America, basically, the United States didn't fulfill something the administration pushed but never really pushed it hard enough about IMF reform. China's gone off and set up a version of the IMF that's Chinese-run, yes. And the Brits and a lot of the Europeans joined it. And, we're either going to set the rules of the road for Asia with trade or China is. And I think I'd rather have America doing this. And we get into intellectual property, we get into a lot of the areas. I think this is a much better trade agreement than what we saw in the 90s.
But what about the fact that you've got one country involved in this, Senator Warner, like Vietnam, that's paying their workers $1 a day? And when we went through, this with NAFTA, with
right. NAFTA.
And I was one of, I think, 3 Republicans in the world that were not in favor of that, me, Pat Buchanan, and someone else. You look back at that, 5 million American manufacturing jobs have disappeared since that. So now we're going to be competing with Vietnam, paying their people 10 cents an hour. How does that work?
Yeah, but John, here's the thing. We're already competing with Vietnam. We're already selling, or they're selling us stuff. If we put this regime in place, where I get upset with the anti-trade folks is we basically have very few barriers. Most all of these countries can still sell to us on a regular basis. Where the barriers are, where the high tariffs are, especially on things like ag, on cars to Japan, are these countries. We have a pretty open system, and yet we're playing with one hand tied behind our back. I think you'll see, for example, in Vietnam, there are efforts here to try to improve worker safety. They got to raise their environmental standards. We don't say directly to pay, but if you got to push up your environmental standards, we all know that costs money. That'll drive up their costs. If we're going to suddenly be able to start selling in our products, one of the things we sell the most are movies, intellectual product like that. They rip us off like mad. On all those areas. This is going to give us some place to take them to court. And remember, the biggest offender is China. China's not in this deal. So we're going to still have to compete with China. So I, again, rather put these other 11 countries in our camp. And what I also say, John, and listen, I'm going to get more grief from Democrats and Republicans on this. It's hard to think of me that you're now sitting in the Nancy Pelosi camp. But
no, actually, Warren. Hey, I signed up for it.
I knew I'd get a rise. Listen, listeners. This is the Fredericks Pelosi argument here that I'm fighting against. But there is just the fact that a lot of the lowest skilled jobs, the textile jobs, the furniture jobs, we lost a lot of those. Some of the manufacturing, the lower end manufacturing jobs. I think at any globalization of the economy, some of those jobs were probably going to migrate. Now, what we've got now with better energy costs here in America, with better supply chain, we're bringing some of those jobs back, the higher skilled jobs. And I think this agreement, respectfully, is it's not perfect. But if we can open up 11 more markets and we can start pushing our companies to sell more stuff, they want to buy American stuff. We've got to let them have it.
All right, well, that's going to be the final word. When you see your colleague from Massachusetts, Beth Warren, in the hall, tell her that I signed up for Ready for Warren. Thank you, Mark. Hey, final thing. I'm just out of time, but just very quickly, I've got Donald Trump on my show tomorrow. What questions should I ask him?
I would ask him, how does a man of his maturity maintain a hair mane as, spectacularly coiffed as he does all the time?
I do have the hair envy, Senator. No question. Thank you for your time, Senator Mark Warner.